There was another one about oyster flatulence, worrying climate scientists. Now, what kind of climate scientist sits at home worrying, wringing their hands, just, oh my God, oyster flatulence. What are we coming to? Anyway, this is how absurd the whole thing has become.
My guest today, again, is Jon Pepper. What are we talking about here today?
Well, we're talking about my next book. Last time around, it was Missy's Twitch, which was issued in October of 2023. This time it's Hostile Climate, which is coming out this month. By the time most of your folks hear this, it will be out. And right now it's available for pre-order. But the issue date is November 19th. It'll be available in all the usual places: Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Walmart, Google Books, and independent bookstores really around the world. So if you like, Tom, I can get this, put up a few slides here and we can talk through this. All right, so the book is Hostile Climate, and Hostile Climate, the title refers to a lot of things about the climate, not just the climate change that we talk about frequently on your show, but also the environment in which this story takes place. It is available through booksellers around the world. I notice it's in countries from Scandinavia, UK, Australia, Taiwan, Singapore, you name it. So it's out there, and hope people get a chance to look it up. A little background on me, Tom. We've gone through this before, but just as a refresher, I was an executive in the energy industry, ran global corporate communications for a big oil and gas firm based in New York. Did corporate communications also, ran that for an auto company. I worked in the media as a business columnist for the Detroit News for 10 years. Also was a publisher of a magazine and website in covering the commercialization of nanotechnology. And I did a talk show, a morning drive talk show in Detroit once upon a time. For the past 10 years, I've been running an agency in New York called Indelible. We help companies protect, defend themselves as needed. And that also goes for high-profile individuals who we've advised. So Fossil Feuds is something that I've been working on the last few years as well. That's a series of books, and here they are. A Turn in Fortune started 2018. That was about, all these books are related. They're all centering around an energy company that is embattled by activists, politicians, each other, etc. The first one, A Turn in Fortune, was about a rivalry at the top of the company, where a scion of the industrialist founder of the company battles his CEO because the CEO is getting too much credit for the company's success. So somebody's got to go. Heirs on Fire is about a further battle inside the family for who should control the company. Green Goddess is an effort by Crow Power Company to show its green bona fides. What's it doing to try to transition? And they settle on fusion energy. The fourth book, Missy's Twitch, was about an heiress to the Crow Power family throne, and she is vexed by her guilt over climate change. And as a result, she develops this mysterious twitch, which is quickly used by politicians to show the devastating effects of climate change. And she's made a bit of a political pawn, at least till she figures things out. And finally, there's Hostile Climate coming out now. And we can talk about that a bit right now. This is the new book. And I call it New York in a nutshell. It's climate madness leaves this very woke city in the dark, and in more ways than one. It's funny, it's suspenseful, it's a frightening story. I got a nice nod from Judith Curry, who you know very well and your viewers know very well. She said it was clever and wickedly entertaining, a well-informed and insightful message about how the rush to shut off the use of fossil fuels without adequate replacements is the real climate crisis. And really, that is the book in a nutshell. We're really focused on the wrong climate crisis, in my view. And I'm sure a lot of your viewers would agree with that. The story is about an ambitious politician's campaign to blame the Crow Power Company for climate change. And that's something that you know is going on around the country. States are going after energy companies. They're suing them for whatever they can dream up. Sometimes it's fraud. Sometimes it's some other sort of deception. Usually what they're looking for is publicity. They're looking for money, and they're looking for ways to cripple the fossil fuel companies as best they can. The lead characters in this story, one is Lindsay Harper Crow, who runs the company. She's familiar to readers of most of all of my books, actually. And she's the chair of the company, and she's truly embattled. And her nemesis is Felicity Two Blue Eyes Redfeather, who is a pretendian. She is kind of a fake Indian. She's used her supposed ancestry as a Native American, even though she has blonde hair and blue eyes, as a way to advance her own career, both politically, academically, and so forth. Stop me if you've heard that kind of characterization before. So there's that. The setting is this crazy woke city, but New York is not alone in this. I mean, I think anyone who is experiencing some of this climate madness around the world, whether that's in California, the state of Washington, Oregon, your state, Minnesota, Tom, Massachusetts, the UK, Germany, all throughout Europe, anyone who's experiencing this knows that this is a constant issue. And it's usually driven by these guilt-ridden elites who want to so-called save the planet. So there are three parts of this book, and it's clearly delineated. The first part is an investigation into Crow power and the harassment of Lindsay as she tries to go about running this company. And so they're raiding her office, they're taking her phones, and the family is trying to discuss what the heck are we going to do about this. The second part is the trial, which is not just Lindsay Harper Crow and Crow power on trial. It's really about CO2 on trial also, because that's what they have fingered the activists as the culprit in I don't know if they think it actually. I'm not sure anyone really thinks this, but they say it's the cause of some sort of climate crisis. And then the third part is the consequences of all this. So what happens after you investigate and harass a company and then you put it on trial and then there's a verdict, and then what are the consequences? And that's where it really ticks up into kind of a thrilling conclusion. So this book is inspired by real events, and I want to talk a little bit about what some of those real events are, because I think they affect so many of the people who are watching your podcast. At the top of the list is this. What inspired this book? Right after we did our last podcast, Tom, I saw this piece in the Wall Street Journal. It was on the editorial page, New York's near zombie apocalypse. And it was about how a storm had nearly brought New York to its knees. And so this made me curious, what exactly happened here? Why are you hearing about this? What was it? So it got me looking into this report that was put out by regulators and who look at energy reliability, excuse me. And so I gathered the report, I went through it, and it was about how the extreme cold weather around Christmas time in 2022 impacted the reliability of the grid, but also, and this was even more important, I think in some ways, was the natural gas infrastructure in the eastern part of the grid. Now, this is the old eastern United States, goes up into Canada and so forth. So Winter Storm Elliot was a bomb cyclone, as they called it. It was 2,000 miles wide. And so what it was that it was the fifth time in 11 years. This was not some one-off kind of thing. It was the fifth time in 11 years in which an unplanned cold weather related event jeopardized grid reliability. There were more than almost 3,600 unplanned outages. And then what also happened is the gas dropped to reliability threatening low pressures. And had Con Ed not activated its liquefied natural gas facility, its LNG facility, and taken other emergency measures, or had the cold weather not abated, it would have faced large-scale outages. And that becomes really complicated and really tricky. So here we are rolling toward disaster. Once you get the electricity restored on a circuit, all the homes can pretty much return to normal pretty quickly. They've got a lot of practice on this in California, where they have blackouts and brownouts all the time because their energy reliability is so terrible, and because they have to keep turning things off because they don't want fossil fuels involved, blah, blah, blah. But you can get the lights turned back on, you can get the heating and air conditioning systems returning to normal. By contrast, the natural gas system requires you to purge the system, essentially. Make sure you go house to house individually, make sure there's no gas in the line. You have to individually light every pilot light. So Con Edison said after the storm, and in this report, they said it would have taken months to restore service, months. So imagine that in New York City. It's the middle of winter. It's the coldest time of the year. You've got all these high rises and millions of people, and the gas is out. You've got a potential catastrophe. You talk about, the alarmists like to talk about the climate catastrophe, which seems to be imaginary, but they talk about it regularly. This is a real one right on our doorstep, and they ignored it. No one seems to really want to talk about it very much. So an inconvenient truth on this is that gas, even though there's this big drive toward electrification, we got to drive electric vehicles, we have to have electric stoves, et cetera, electricity is largely powered by natural gas. It's the biggest component of electricity. So you have to have it. So that means you got to have pipelines, you got to have LNG, you've got to have something. And because natural gas is still the largest consumer, electricity is still the largest power generation, largest consumer of natural gas. So the recommendation out of this report was, let's study this, whether we need more pipelines, more storage, and so on. Well, so here's the media digging for this report. And they just were really furiously trying to understand what was in this report. And here on the right side of your screen is all the coverage about this report in the New York Times, the Washington Post, on CBS, NBC, and ABC. Whoops, there isn't any. Wouldn't you know? They missed it. Well, all that digging and they didn't find it. So no, and if you had said that there was a toad somewhere that was endangered by climate change, of course, it'd be all over it. But they just ignore this real potential calamity. Our energy policy in New York and large parts of this country and also other parts of the world, stranger than fiction. I call it the impossible dream. In New York, they've revised the clean energy standard in 2019 to require 100% carbon-free electricity from both renewable sources and nuclear energy by 2040. That's 16 years from now. So how are we going to actually get there? They're shutting down nuclear power. They shut down the Indian Point plant a few years ago that provided a good bit of energy for the city and the state. And they talk about possibly having some more nuclear energy, but that, as you know, takes a long time, even if it's small modular energy. So here's where we are in terms of actual consumption. That's where, in terms of New York's energy and many other states, natural gas by far is the biggest source of consumption and energy. And way down there where that red arrow is little renewables. That includes wind and solar. It's infinitesimal in terms of what the city and the state need. Even if you just limit it to electricity generation, gas is still the predominant source. And there you see that utility scale solar is less than 1% and wind is less than 3%. So these are from official sources. This is public record, easily accessible by anybody, but not apparently by our policymakers. New York loves the planet. It hates pipelines. They're out protesting all the time. The activists are really pleased and proud of themselves for killing one pipeline after another, even though we need the gas tremendously. I should go back one slide because this is important too. Net imported electricity is a key part of our energy puzzle here, because we're dependent on the kindness of strangers. We have to bring this electricity in from other areas in order to meet the demands here. Nevertheless, we hate pipelines. This year alone, New York has killed 2 major pipelines. One is from the Marcellus to New York State. The other one is across New York to the Rockaways from New Jersey. New York also hates LNG, and they're very proud of that. Stop spending our money. We don't want fracked gas. This is what opens my book, is whether Crow Power can get a permit for a pipeline. And Lindsay Harper Crow is in a debate with the governor, Frank Cardini, who is the opponent of Felicity Redfeather. This is the thinking, as far as I can tell, behind New York's climate laws. Involves a little bit of smoke and dope, some pixie dust, some unicorns, maybe hamster wheels. It has no relationship to reality whatsoever. Nevertheless, this is the path that we are on. Part of the issues that they don't understand here also is that the hostile climate includes China. China's been deep into our infrastructure. They've been hacking into companies with pipelines, hacking into our infrastructure. And why are they doing that? Well, here's the FBI director saying they're doing this on a regular basis. They've been after 23 pipeline operators. And what they do is they have this hacking system. It's off the coast of China on this island. And they have all these hackers who work bots and so forth, and they are crashing into our system on a regular basis. And it seems like they go in, they gather information, and they pull back. They don't actually crash any systems just yet, but they've demonstrated the ability to go in and do it when they want to. Clearly, as the FBI director said, they are figuring out ways to create havoc in our critical infrastructure at a time of their choosing. This is a subplot in Hostile Climate. I think it's kind of interesting to look at. I sort of dramatize this whole idea. Why would they do that, and what would be their motivation? So another part of the Hostile Climate here is Lawfare, which, as you know, is a big part of what's going on with climate issues around the country and around the world, as we mentioned. Right now, there are 32 lawsuits targeting fossil fuel companies over climate change. And they'll charge anything. Well, you violated laws on you didn't protect consumers. It's a public nuisance. You didn't warn us. It's fraud. It's racketeering. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And what they want to do is force oil companies to pay damages caused by climate change and impose penalties for deceptive business practices and fund corrective education campaign about climate threats. Now this is interesting. Of course, they want money. This is seen as a boodle bag by some of the activists and some of the state treasuries for how they can get some money. But one of the issues explored in the book during the trial is exactly how could they quantify these so-called damages for climate change? What is it? What percentage? Which sources of emissions actually contributed to this climate change? Exactly how much climate change has there been? How much could you attribute that to natural variability versus sources such as carbon or methane emissions? And nobody has figured out how to quantify any of that. They can't figure out if there's been any actual damage, whether it's anything different than what would have happened naturally. But nevertheless, they persist. So here we are. In New York, we've sued ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, arguing that greenwashing ads from oil companies portray them as climate leaders, and this is some offense to humanity. The suit, of course, seeks financial penalties. Now, who pays the bill for these lawsuits? Well, some of it's done by organizations like the Center for Climate Integrity, which empowers communities with the knowledge and tools they need to hold fossil fuel companies accountable for the deception and damage they've caused. But again, they can't tell you how much damage they've caused or if they've caused any damage at all. But they keep trying, and they want to force companies to pay up. One of the organizations that pays for some of this, oddly enough, of course, is the Rockefeller Family Fund. They are hell-bent on limiting climate change and holding polluters accountable. And there's old John D. looking rather bemused at this whole spectacle of his descendants doing this, but there he is, and that's what's going on. He's not the only one. There's another heiress to an oil fortune. Getty oil fortune heiress helped fund climate activists who have targeted artworks in museums. Just Stop Oil. I guess what they're upset about is their oil paintings. So obviously that's a major contributor to climate change. So anyway, they made these ridiculous and colossally stupid and futile gestures to destroy priceless works of art to make sure that we know that they are upset. Then in New York, we also have Letitia James. She's a very ambitious politician herself, and she has sued Donald Trump for years of financial fraud. This was a very dubious, questionable case. It's being appealed, and nevertheless, they have used this particular law to go after Trump, a particular law to go after Trump to charge him with fraud. And the idea is that they can seize his business assets. That's one of the subplots of what's going on against Lindsay Harper Crow in Hostile Climate. During the trial, you got CO2 on trial. And I thought it was interesting. I just did a little search on images of CO2, odorless, invisible, but yet if you put in CO2 in Google and you hit images, you come up with these sinister things like this, these clouds coming up, spilling out CO2, and this crazy haze. It looks like it might be out of Chernobyl, and it's just nonsense. But it's part of the invention, part of the propaganda effort. So there's a good discussion about whether this is actually pollution or not. And I think there are folks that you've had on your show, like from the CO2 Coalition, who would say, you guys are talking out your hat at very best. Another part of this too is that there's a discussion on what is really what these CO2 emissions can do. Because you can Google anything, just any subject you care to Google, and say climate change, and there's a study on it. And it says, oh, it's just the worst. Something terrible has happened because whatever activity it is causes climate change. And the way I would kind of put it is that our original sin is being born in the eyes of the activists, because we exhale right from the get-go. And every exhalation after and every activity we do after is a CO2 emission in some way. And so what this does is it creates this enormous opportunity for control of every single activity, which is what they're after. Many people have made this point that it's the control button. It's not, but they can't tell you, they have no real alternatives to this that make any kind of practical sense. People are the problem. Ultimately, when you get to it, it's and you'll see this too. There are a number of organizations that I found online who want to reduce the population somehow. You start to get into crazy, almost eugenics kind of arguments when you start talking about some of the more extreme activists in this area. But they're saying, let's improve access to reproductive health care, family planning options, girls' education. Essentially, let's make sure we lower the birth rate. And some people would take it even further and say, let's take other measures to lower how many people are around. It's insane. And, right now we have more than 8 billion people on the planet. And some of these climate activists actively argue that it should only be 3 billion or maybe 3.7 billion. And others will say, no, it should only be 1 billion people on the planet. And one of the arguments raised in the book is, what are you saving the planet for, if not for people? Are you saving it for mosquitoes or what is it? And of course, that's the question they can't really answer either. But they seem to hold rocks as sacred. And I know a lot of geologists who have a lot of respect for rocks, and they use it to figure out what really has happened over time with the climate. But it's you get into these circular arguments that are kind of rather absurd on their face. Another issue that contributes to the hostile climate is, of course, the media. And the rules in the media, and I come from media again, I was a journalist for 20-some years, and the rules changed. The idea was that one of the sayings they had in the newsroom is you comfort the afflicted and you afflict the comfortable. Okay, you're helping the little guy. But you do this with objective reporting. You present both sides of a story and you let people decide for themselves what makes the most sense. They decide what's right and what's wrong. But then came Donald Trump in 2016. And here he was getting close to possibly becoming president. And the New York Times had a front page column saying, wait a second, this is testing that whole idea about objectivity. That doesn't make sense. We hate this guy so much that we've got to stop this notion of fairness. We've got to just go after him and not treat things as give things equal weight. So there's this whole concept, I say goodnight, Chet, here, because the old ideas are out the window. They call it now what we used to call in the newsroom objectivity or fair reporting. They call false balance, because things like climate change, claims that the earth is not warming, are regularly referred to in news versus only editorials as denial, misleading, or debunked. And I know a lot of your guests have experience with this being called denialists and just crazy people. But what's different about it was that that stuff used to be reserved for columns. I used to write a column. I was entitled to my opinion, or to editorial pages. Now it's just riddled throughout the news media. It's in the regular news stories, and it's just stated as fact. Today's weather is near a record, and that's because of climate change, which is caused by humans and gas emissions, blah, blah, blah. So it's really gone over. And fortunately, there are now other outlets for information, places like X, where frankly, I found lots of interesting information, lots of sources of dissent in this area. I found lots of good books by people like Steve Koonin, Judith Curry, Ron Barmby, many others. And so you do find that there are other opinions, but they're harder to find. So nevertheless, this new journalism, as they call it, really goes like this. They confront so-called false claims on the fly. They did this last month with Trump's false claims, supposedly about the federal response to Hurricane Helene. And it said that he was wrong to say that FEMA had neglected areas that had voted for Republicans. Then we just found out this week, well, that wasn't so wrong. In fact, FEMA ended up firing an employee for telling relief workers to skip houses with Trump signs. And now we find out again today that it wasn't just one employee doing this. It was a number of states, and it was other employees as well. So all I'm saying there is that fact-checking aggressively in the way they do one side of the story, and politicians they don't like, is also fraught with its own room for errors. And what they think is false at one point is not necessarily held up as false in the long run. And I would argue that a lot of what they say about climate change is completely false, but they don't want to talk about the science anymore. The science, of course, in their view, has been settled. Let's just move on to these wonderful solutions that we have and save the planet. So this is one of the things that influences journalists right now in terms of how they cover things. There's this organization called Covering Climate Now. I mentioned this in our last podcast last year, and they give talking points to journalists. They train them. They say, hey, let's do stories that show people exactly what's going on. And they're activists, and they want journalists to be activists too, not people who just present information. And all you need to know about Covering Climate Now, which has hundreds and hundreds of media organizations that it works with, is that they put Greta Thunberg, they laud a story about her as a climate warrior. So take that for any kind of credibility you want to assign to it. Of course, Greta Thunberg has given up her real aim here, and that is that, now she's running around talking about dismantling capitalism, and climate change is kind of taken. That's just one reason to do it. But as Covering Climate says, there simply will not be the public awareness and political will needed to tackle the crisis unless news organizations dramatically improve and expand their climate coverage. That's what they're pushing for. So you end up with this, climate journalism. It's a man's world. I did a little Google search, or a little search on Washington Post site yesterday, and I thought Michael Mann and climate. It came up with 4,830 results, and obviously they love this guy, famed climate scientist. He's against those right-wing bloggers, those terrible, terrible people. And of course, the most recent story about him was his forecast group predicted the busiest hurricane season on record, predicts the busiest hurricane season on record with 33 storms. Well, so far this year, we're right near the end of hurricane season, and there have been 17. So he's about half right. But I circled this little line at the bottom that said, It was a key factor in an unprecedented Atlantic forecast, because that's the only aspect of this that's unprecedented. And it frequently is the coverage of climate change. It's the forecast, it's the predictions, it's the calls that there's going to be this horrendous calamity coming up in the future. That's what's unprecedented. When the actual results come in, it's kind of like, what happened? Well, nobody goes back and reports on it, because that would disrupt the narrative, and they want us to act. They want us to move. They want us to restrict fossil fuels and supposedly save the planet, although I increasingly in doubt that that's really their objective. Then you have somebody like John Clauser, famously won a Nobel Prize. Then all of a sudden that was just in 2022. And yet when he said that climate change was not really a crisis, then suddenly the ceiling fell down on him. All kinds of criticism. And in the Washington Post, it was the vast majority of climate scientists, because this is how science is decided now, is you have majority rule. And once the majority rules, then that's how climate is figured out. Forget evidence gathering, forget theories, forget observation, forget trying to determine whether what you thought actually holds up under verification. So anyway, he's been trashed by the Washington Post. And their subhead and part of the story was pure garbage, which is just really disrespectful and inaccurate. Another part of this hostile climate is the U.S. government. The American Energy Alliance has been documenting all the ways in which the government has been making it harder to produce oil and gas, and that's a long-running list. But things look like they're about to change here, because this is the new fashion in Washington. As it will be in January, is drill, baby, drill. We'll see if that holds up or not. The Trump administration is still going to face very heavy headwinds from states and from organizations that will be suing anything that they try to do. It won't be as easy as simply decreeing, but we'll see how that goes. And then hostile climate in terms of literature, which is my area. So I looked up in the New York Public Library, what's some compelling climate fiction? And so they ominously said, here's some climate fiction to read before it becomes nonfiction. In other words, these terrible things are gonna happen. So these are summaries of some of the books that the New York Public Library recommends. One involves a perilous journey in search of water. Another is an environmental scientist begins a project to alter the world. Another is in post-climate disaster Alberta. There's the end of the ocean. There's another one with a mother desperate to save her dying daughter in a world ravaged by climate change. She joins a hunter-gatherer initiative. And then in this one, this takes all the different themes of climate change. In a near future world plagued by superstorms, rising sea levels, global flooding, heat waves, and deadly pandemics, one man has a big idea for reversing global warming, despite the possible consequences for the planet and all of humanity. Okay, well, prior to all these books, there was this one, Michael Crichton's State of Fear from 2004, which took a very different kind of view on this whole thing and whether there was really reason to be panicked about it. Well, by the way, I'd also mention this. If you haven't read State of Fear and you get it online and you get the digital book, at least the version that I got has 3 lectures by him, 3 speeches that he gave, which are really good and hold up just as well 20 years later as they did way back when. And then on the other side is a bookend, appropriately, is Hostile Climate. I'd throw Missy's Twitch in there and possibly Green Goddess as well. So they all take on climate in various ways, and also some of the ridiculous politics behind it. Just to kind of shed a little more light on the book that I've been talking about and what's coming out. A nice review by Ron Barmby, a geologist out of Canada, who wrote a piece for the Climate Dispatch about hostile climate. And he said it was an interesting way to pull together a very complicated story by just telling a great story. And the part at the end is the most salient point that I would like people to think about whether we're on the right climate change path. I would urge you to read the full review on Climate Change Dispatch, and I'm going to talk about another one in a second too. Not everyone loved my book. There was a kind of a reviewer who came at it from the other side of the divide here and said that my satirical take on environmentalism eventually wears thin. The author creates scolding caricatures. A famous scientist gets paid to write nonsense about sea turtle sex lives and oyster flatulence. Rainwater Jones, a young climate activist, stages her own arrest to profit from TikTok views. Protesters are portrayed as paid off shills, insane, or too lazy to work. Now, if she'd actually done any homework, she would see that, in fact, activists do stage arrests for cameras and for TikTok, as Greta Thunberg has done many times. She'd also see there was actually a ridiculous study on climate warming and sea turtle sex ratios. And there was another one about oyster flatulence, worrying climate scientists. Now, what kind of climate scientist sits at home worrying, wringing their hands, just, oh my God, oyster flatulence, what are we coming to? Anyway, this is how absurd the whole thing has become. I'm fine taking that criticism because I think it just shows a lot of people out there don't know. They're just clueless. And why would, given the media landscape, given what they see in literature, given all their sources of information, some of the things that I point out in the book would just seem unreal to them. And yet they're very real. And so then on the other hand, a very nice review of Hostile Climate from Tom Richard, the editor of Climate Change Dispatch. And I like this, thrilling and thought-provoking, exploration, blah, blah, blah. I would urge you to go and read this review, but he called it a must-read for anyone interested in gripping contemporary narrative that reflects today's environmental and political landscape. Nuanced, dramatic take on one of the most pressing issues of our time. That's a nice way to put it, I think. So with that, that's my presentation.
I do have a couple of questions. One is, it sounds like in recent years, we've been pretty close to real disaster, maybe in Texas and in New York, in terms of it might take months to get back and more people dead. Sounds like we've kind of gotten lucky. Do you think we've done anything to make the situation better? Or are we still right on the edge of horrible things happening this winter if the storm's too long, et cetera?
I think we're still on the edge of potential disaster. We've done nothing to mitigate this since Winter Storm Elliot in New York. But the other storm you mentioned in Texas, there were 800 people that died. Now they're much more highly reliant on renewables, as you know, which is kind of odd for a state that produces so much natural gas, but that's where they are. And so I just don't think there's enough conversation. There's almost no public conversation about the reliability of energy and also about the affordability of energy. There's some about the affordability. That became a political football over the last few years. Republicans were clamoring for more reliable energy and pointing out all the ways in which we had probably influenced the price in the wrong direction. But the reliability aspect is hugely important, and I just don't see it. And here's the other part of that, Tom, is that there's no slowing down the demand for energy and for electricity. Look what's happening. The growth is going through the roof. The demand growth curve is going like this, and the supply curve is not keeping pace at all, especially when you factor in things like artificial intelligence, chip manufacturers, electrification of various appliances, vehicles, and so on. You're seeing now that some companies are going out of their way to secure their own secure energy. For instance, Microsoft talking about 3 Mile Island and kind of reviving nuclear energy there. I've heard some stories about companies building their own nuclear power, even below ground, to power factories. They can't depend on wind and sun. These factories got to be running around the clock, and they have to have constant streams of electricity, and they can't afford intermittency. So they need dedicated sources of power, and they need to be reliable, and they can't afford a brownout or a blackout. So they're looking at their own individual ways to secure energy. But where does that leave the rest of us? I mean, in New York, in Manhattan here, in Bronx and Queens and everywhere, we're at the end of the pipelines. So what happened in Elliot was that normally we would borrow electricity or borrow, from other parts of the country. We couldn't get it because everyone was having their problems. North Carolina was, Tennessee Valley Authority was having problems. And so when everyone's in the same bind, what do? And we were ill prepared for that. And I don't sense any change in that. I know that the regulators and the people who look after the grid and after the gas infrastructure are concerned, but that's just not a priority for the people who lead the state. They're more worried about, can we meet these climate commitments? Can we reduce emissions? And you'll see also, I read a story in the Atlanta Journal and Constitution talking about the energy needs for Georgia going forward because they have demands for some of these businesses that have to have a good supply of energy. Well, the story was all framed in the sense of, oh my gosh, they're going to use energy, but that's going to mean more fossil fuel emissions. I get to the end of the story and it says this reporter has been financed by some particular climate initiative. And it was like, well, of course, they're framing it all in those terms. So the reliability gets kicked to the curb, and we're sort of we just have to pray at this point that something bad isn't going to happen. The thing that did save us in Winter Storm Elliot, as mentioned, was LNG. They have an LNG facility out there. They fill it up every November, and they were able to vaporize that LNG, get it into the gas system, and prevent it from collapsing. But a lot of people in New York want to stop LNG too. I mean, we had that on the Gulf Coast. Also, the Biden administration put in a moratorium on exports of LNG from the Gulf to Europe. And so here we are with, this LNG facility. How long will that be allowed? We don't know. It's not where the discussion is. And I don't know any politician who's taking it up and saying, this is where we really need to focus.
That brings up an interesting point to me because Meredith Angwin was on my podcast. She was talking about the one great thing about coal power is you can have a big pile of coal right next to the plant, and when you need it, it's there. Do you have a sense as to how quick you can get LNG to New York if suddenly they're running out? Could it be shipped there fast?
Well, it's funny you mention that because that's a big part of the end of the book. I won't say because it's part of the suspense in the story, but no, coal, the great thing about coal is its portability and the fact that it can sit there, in a big pile outside the plant forever if you wanted to, and you can always bring it in. But, that's just not part of the equation anymore. It would take some period of time, and you got to get around, where is it from? There are only so many ports around the US that have LNG. There's one near New York, up near Boston. I think it's in Gloucester. Next closest is probably Chesapeake Bay down in Maryland. Then you start getting down further down, and most of them are in the Gulf Coast. So that's where the LNG is, and we're leaving ourselves open.
Do you follow what's going on around the whole world in various countries about whether we've peaked with this whole insanity? I'm curious if New York State might be just a pocket of insanity, or how is it going from your perspective elsewhere, or in New York even?
Well, I think in New York the insanity remains, although I think we may be over the peak. I do get a sense of that. There was a editorial in the Wall Street Journal today talking about COP29 and how useless and ridiculous it is, and maybe it might be the last, because these confabs where they try to plan, what they're going to do for climate change are really, it just shows that all it does is demonstrate the hypocrisy of all these people flying in on private jets, talking about how terrible it is that there are carbon emissions in the atmosphere and what they're going to do. But I would say this, I don't think it hasn't quite bottomed out, not by a long shot. You're still seeing in the UK net zero aspirations. You still have it in Germany. They're finding ways to kind of delay here and there as they need some energy and they realize they've gone too far. But the aspirations are still there. And I think with the Starmer government in the UK, that's still a big centerpiece of what they want to do. So the Western nations, France moved away from nuclear energy for a while. I think they're kind of going back to that. But we need more. I mean, there needs to be a much bigger push. I think hopefully the world will really start to focus on this issue of reliability first. Get the most reliable, affordable sources of energy we can, make them as clean as you possibly can. I mean, nobody wants to pollute. Forget carbon dioxide for a moment, but just, you don't want nitrous oxide or sulfurous oxides in the air. You don't want the things that impair people's breathing. So you don't want polluted water, you don't want polluted air. Nobody wants that. And so yes, be clean as you possibly can, but make sure we have energy, and also allow it to happen in countries that we are holding hostage. I think what you see in Africa right now is we're using our financial might to prevent them from developing themselves with fossil fuel energy. We're writing the rules that say, no, you must do windmills and solar and so forth, and do this the way we want you to. I think it's kind of a energy imperialism to me. Help them grow, help them live and develop. And I don't think that's been embraced yet at all.
From my perspective, I'm seeing a lot of sanity on podcasts, even on the Joe Rogan podcast and on X. And as the legacy media is having so many problems with CNN facing layoffs, et cetera, it seems like sanity is winning. But is that what you're seeing?
I think so. I think there's been a pretty significant pushback. I think some of the books that have been out there, I think, as you mentioned, Rogan podcasts like yours, you've been giving sunlight and exposure to a lot of great voices out there that don't get into the Washington Post, as we pointed out, or if they do, they're maligned in some fashion. But you see a lot of influential people. There was a piece in the Washington Post also about William Happer going to an education conference and getting disrespected. I mean, he's a brilliant scientist. How can they do that? But there are many good people out there who are speaking up more, and I think helping to restore some sense of sanity to this whole equation. So I'm hopeful, and I think over the next few years there's an opportunity to change the conversation and to pivot to what the really important objectives are first and prioritize them in the right way.
So I'm just looking at your bio on your website again, and it seems to me you're kind of perfectly placed. Your experience is so good for writing books like this because all of your different varied experience. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's one reason I decided to write books. I thought I've had some pretty interesting experiences. I've been in corporate boardrooms and leadership team meetings, and I've been on the other side in journalism. I mean, when I started off in journalism, then I moved over to the corporate side. I couldn't believe they let me in the room, but they did, and it allowed me to see things. And also, I met lots of politicians, interviewed presidents, met Lady Thatcher. I mean, it's a good experience for kind of understanding the world a bit.
Yeah, so all the experience in journalism, and then tech, right? Nanotechnology is in there, and then executive for energy and automotive companies. So you kind of seen it from all angles, it looks like.
That's right, I have. And I've also seen it from officials. I've, advised officials in government or from government who were in there, and advised high profile individuals who've been under fire for one reason or another. So I've kind of experienced it in a lot of different ways. And I'm a bit of a news junkie still to this day. I mean, I'm like just constantly checking, but my number one source for news these days is X, actually. It's just, now you have to verify things. You can't just take everything for granted. A lot of things are manufactured even on X, but there's still a lot of good information, and it shows up there faster than almost anywhere else. So that's been huge.
So just speaking of X, there was a whole idea when Musk bought it out. He cut, 85% of the employees, whatever. We didn't notice any difference from the outside. Do you hold any hope that he can do something similar, at least to some areas of the federal government?
I do. I mean, this is going to be fun to watch. There's going to be so much resistance, obviously. These people are really entrenched in DC. It's a big club, but a lot of them haven't shown up for work in years. I mean, they just haven't. The COVID thing was kind of killing it. But, the first step, take out the Department of Education, as they're talking about. Will anyone notice? Put those resources back in the states. But since the Department of Education was created by Jimmy Carter, U.S. went from number one in the world in terms of education results to, I think, to number 24. So I think a results-oriented government would be great. And if we had, think of all the resources that would free up to actually improve things rather than just go into this drain that we pour money down.
Do you have any sense as to whether Trump can kind of turn off the money printer and halt inflation?
We'll see. I mean, he's fallen a little bit victim to the idea that I'll pay for this, I'll pay for that, and you gotta be careful. There's only so much that you can do. We're already doing this on a big credit card. We've got a huge unsustainable debt, and so we don't want to get into a situation where we have to print off a bunch more money just to pay off that debt. That would be really stupid. I am hopeful that they can trim enough waste. Take Elon and take Vivek and unleash them and say, let's go after this. Let's try to rework the government. Almost, if you did almost a zero balance, start from a zero balance budget kind of thing and say, what do we really need here? And build on that. I think that would make so much more sense than just continuing to publish regulations after regulation that nobody understands, tax code that nobody understands. I can't even read my own tax return. I don't understand what's on there. I mean,
Do you have any sense as to who might be the next Secretary of Energy?
I don't yet. I wouldn't be surprised if he pulled somebody from industry, but I don't know who he's got there, who's close to him. You know, they're talking about how Trump is hiring loyalists. I don't know any president who's come in and said, I'd like to hire a bunch of good disloyalists. I mean, who does that? So he's getting criticism for it, but I think so far, I like the fact that he's going outside the usual Beltway crowd and picking people who can look at this from a more objective point of view and bring their own experiences. There's nobody more brilliant in our era than Elon Musk. I mean, people can call him an oddball or criticize him for this and that, but he's the Thomas Edison of our age, and let him take a whack at it. Why not?
I'm frantically looking here for a tweet I saw yesterday, maybe from Whitney Webb, saying some horrible stuff that maybe Trump, his administration will bring in some sort of central bank digital currency based on trying to solve the carbon problem. I can't find it right now, but do you have fears like that? I'm hoping that would not.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I hope not. I do think one of the things that has not turned yet is the conversation that still carbon dioxide is the culprit. I don't think that has been debunked as much as it needs to be in the public discourse. It has been on your show. It has been on your tweets and so forth, and many of your guests. But I think there's still a widespread belief out there that this is the principal culprit of some sort of any kind of bad weather, a drought in the Northeast like we're having now, a bad storm like we had recently in Asheville, North Carolina. It's always attributed to emissions. And so people may not see it as the top priority in their lives right now. But what happens is that once you do solve these other issues, if you do get a hold of inflation, if you do bring down prices, if energy becomes more affordable, you start to develop more rich people problems. And that's where climate change comes in again. Let's perfect this world. Yeah.
Okay. Any other points you'd like to make before we finish up here?
No, I think that about covers it for me, I think. Anything else on your mind?
I think that's it for now, but yeah, thanks a ton for your work. I really appreciate what you're doing. I love your both the books and the presentations you're doing. It's good stuff.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks. I appreciate that. Thanks so much for your time, Tom. I follow you, as you know, on Twitter. I like your stuff and like your pugnacity in going after this.
Jon Pepper, author of Hostile Climate. Talk to you later.
Thank you. All right. Take care.